comes from a book written by Professor Heschel of the Jewish Theological Seminary called The Prophets. And in the absence of meaningful and significant prayer in the 20th century, we have to pick prayers up from where we can. It exemplifies the two types of prayer which we use in our worship service, what I have referred to previously in frequent weeks as davening and praying. Davening is quotation prayer, which can be in Hebrew or in English, where we are using the words of prayer writers, prayers, those who prayed of a bygone age, and by quoting, whether in Hebrew or in English, by davening, whether in Hebrew or in English, we identify with those who have gone before. Very often it is very simple, by means of a translation in the mind, to jump from the ethical, spiritual, and moral concerns which motivated their prayer from the ancient idiom and vocabulary into our own. We do not share their theology, but we can make that translation. That is a very important part of the service. Unfortunately, most of it takes place before you kind ladies and gentlemen are in the synagogue. And I would dearly wish that the traditional section of the service, which we commence with at 10 o'clock, would be enjoyed by many more of you. I say that more in sorrow than in anger. And I hope that in future weeks, perhaps, you will be here to participate more fully in the quotation dimension of our service, because it is not possible to get the full flavor of what we are trying to do without having the modern parts placed into the perspective, the context of the ancient and the traditional. The davening, the quotation then, is deliberate repetition in English or in Hebrew of that which has been said affirmatively in the past. In addition, we have to affirm something ourselves about the modern world, and this is because we do not have many modern prayer rites. Professor Heschel is one who does manage to convey a great deal of meaning in very beautiful prose. Dr. Kaplan is another, but their output is not very large, so we have to search their books to see if we cannot utilize some of the prayers. Here from the Prophets by Professor Heschel, we have alternating quotations from the prophets and what I would define as prayerful, relevant, meaningful observations or affirmations about the moral challenge in our own age. You will see that when we get to it. Now, in order to compensate for the paucity of prayer, I have in recent weeks introduced what I call a kavanah, or an introduction or a meditation before reading the English prayer. Someone accused me last week of giving two sermons. Nothing of the kind. First of all, if anything, it was a mini-sermon. And secondly, the trade union would not tolerate such a thing. But there is a need, I think, to consciously break the attention from the davening, which is often done in a kind of a soft and gentle frame of mind, whereby often the mind, I regret, turns to things not immediately of liturgical or spiritual relevance, to a consideration of what we are doing. And as in previous weeks, I find that a quotation from the New York Times may lead us into the modern world with, at least this morning, some reflection on the true significance of this prayer, in which a modern affirmation by one who writes in the spirit of the prophets, and one who in his personal life, Professor Heschel is one of the few leading rabbis of our age who have not stinted himself in throwing himself wholeheartedly into the activist, the social activist life. You know, when any old rabbi does it, it's one thing, but when a rabbi who really could be sitting writing books takes time off to be involved in the forefront of the necessary social action of our age, we find an added dimension and depth to what he has to say. Now, to understand a little of the challenge of the prophets, which is what this prayer is about, and it does this by contrasting between the quotation and the affirmation, although I don't think this was in Professor Heschel's mind. This is simply a chapter taken bodily from the book, The Prophets, and the way we presented it here with the indentation was not in Professor Heschel's mind. He uses the prophetic quotations as quotations. But then, you know, you take a tin of Campbell's soup and you stick it in the middle of a canvas, and you've got modern art, haven't you? And you say, but this is a tin of Campbell's soup. And the artist says, ah, yes, but who thought of putting it in the middle of a canvas? So by the same token, I suppose, what we take from books and the way in which we use them and the context in which we use them in the spirit at least of modern art, whatever that says for it, gives a new dimension. Now here in the New York Times yesterday, many of you must have read some comments by Dr. Bruno Bettelheim on the subject of the spreading disrespect for authority figures. He said that we are all cheating the young today and leading to the breakdown of their inhibitions against violence by showing contemptuous attitudes towards authority figures. He specifically mentioned civil disobedience, contemptuous attitudes towards the police, and the emotional attacks on President Johnson, which he claimed were damaging the mental health of the young. What we've got to develop, Dr. Bettelheim said, what we've got to develop is trust in the institutions of society, the respect for the super-ego representations selected by society, from police and teachers all the way up to the president, whatever you may think of him personally. Well, personally, I'm piqued they didn't include rabbis and clergymen, but still, authority figures. Dr. Bettelheim said that the liberals, the press, and the teachers who failed to assert their authority all shared the blame for denying super-ego models to the young, particularly the poor and disadvantaged. It is devastating to children, he said. We send our children off to school to make their way into the system, and then we tell them that the system is lousy. We vilify the president as a man who is killing babies, and then ask our children to respect authority. If we want to change the system, he continued, we should change it in the voting booth. But we should keep adult concerns away from our children. Observing in this morning's newspaper Adam Clayton Powell returning from Bimini and assured of certain election in the forthcoming election, I wonder what Dr. Bettelheim means by using the voting booth as a means of protecting morality in the high places. And observing in recent weeks, Senator Dodd, a high representative of ethics in American life, with some gall, preaching a moral stance in front of Senator Fulbright's committee, which many of you may have seen on television screens. I wonder whether Dr. Bettelheim has not taken leave of his senses, with great respect to the psychiatric profession. It seems to me that what is truly dangerous in life is precisely to indoctrinate respect for authority figures as such. We have in Jewish tradition a phrase, Adam mechabed et hamakom ve'ein hamakom mechabed et ha'adam. A man confers dignity on the status or his role, but the role or the status does not confer dignity on a man. This is an old intuition in Jewish life, and very often we have found that the old intuitions which Jews worked out by a process of evolution, as it were, over the years, have profound significance. There is the old story about the Bal HaBayit, or the Balabos, depending what part of Europe you come from, who invited somebody home from shul on Shabbos morning for lunch, according to tradition, and offered him the seat at the head of the table. And the guest, of course, with a kind of a Uriah Heepish apologetic stance, said, but after all said and done, you're the Balabayis, you should be sitting at the top of the table. Whereupon the Balabayis says, don't you worry, wherever I sit, I'm the Balabayis. Seems to me that Dr. Bettelheim has got things upside down. When we try to teach our children that some of those people on whom authority in society has fallen are themselves being the one who are most disrespectful to what is right and what is honest and what is moral, I would say we are, to some extent, saving our society rather than destroying it. It is a Jewish tradition that children honor their parents. But rabbinical tradition clearly states that when parents violate God's law, their children are to disobey them. I wonder how Dr. Bettelheim would like that insofar as his authority figures. My father, right or wrong? In Jewish tradition, that is not the case. If one's father tells one to do something which is immoral, this was couched, of course, in traditional Judaism in terms of breaking the Torah. If your father told you to work on Shabbat, or your father told you to eat some food which was not kosher. But the translation is evident. The Jewish tradition long ago realized that it was wrong and unhealthy simply to say that because a man has a status, whether he be a father, or a rabbi, or a teacher, or even the president of the United States, just because of his role, therefore he deserves respect. No, not the place, but the way in which the man deserves the respect. And this is a profoundly important problem. when we look at the Bible and we realize that the great prophets of old had no respect whatsoever for the role of kingship. Nathan, in the presence of David, was not impressed that he had won the last election. Ata ha'ish, he said to David, because David had done something profoundly immoral, totally disinterested in what effect this would have on the superegos of little Israelite children. Because Nathan the prophet knew that there is only one who deserves our absolute respect, and that one is God. Elijah in front of Ahab, when Ahab says to him, "Is it thou, Ocher Israel?" turns round to the king, Elijah, a miserable prophet just with a loincloth on. What sort of a figure must he have cut in the presence of royalty? And said, no, you are the one who has troubled Israel. Did Elijah, the great spiritual leader of the Jewish people, worry about the superegos of the children of his spiritual colleagues of that era? The prophets were far more critical of their society than any Rap Brown of our own day. They used the equivalent, in many respects, of burn, Whitey, burn. The prophets, in the idiom of their own day, predicted dire retribution for the children of Israel. God would make them suffer in a most bloody fashion. Words are used by Jeremiah and by Ezekiel and by Amos and by Hosea, which make Rap Browns look like a book of fairy tales. The temple itself, the profound symbol of Jewish spirituality, was declared by the prophets to be of no avail in the presence of the immorality of the kings and the leaders of the people. Jerusalem shall fall because of the immorality of those in high places who may have the authority status, but who in fact are not contributing to the advancement of moral life in society. It is in this spirit that I would like us to read this prayer, in which we contrast the absolute ethical judgment of society by the prophets, who are not interested in authority figures or in status, but are only concerned whether society measured up to the absolute demands of the highest reflection of the human conscience. That pathetic spirit is what alone will give the right kind of superegos to our children in the modern world. And those parents who truly wish to bring their children up in the right way will not be inhibited by comments from such psychiatrists by pointing out the clay feet of our leaders. As a matter of fact, when I first read Dr. Bettelheim's article, it seemed to me that he was describing exactly the typical German family of the pre-war years, where the father was a little Führer in his home, and where the children behaved as if they were soldiers in an army, where every command had to be obeyed, and where regardless of whether or not the father was right or wrong, his status as father made him in the position of one who gave orders. And that kind of upbringing, far from giving a strong superego, was precisely the kind of psychological building work which made it possible for concentration camps to be built in Europe, because those who had received orders at home were only too prone, only too ready, only too available to receive further orders, irrational orders, immoral orders from other authority figures in society. Our way may be a long way around, but in terms of eternity and in terms of the absolute ethical challenge of the prophets, perhaps it is the only way they have in the long run. Page 70, please join in reading the sections for the congregation. Page 70 in the supplementary prayer book. Those who have a sense of beauty know that a stone is the Shabbat before Purim, when announcements were made in ancient days for the collection of the shekalim to maintain the temple. That is the first of the 5 Shabbatot, Shabbat Shekalim. It is followed by Shabbat Zachor, which is immediately before Purim, and we are commanded to remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people, both then and in all generations. Today is Shabbat Parah, the Shabbat of the cow, and next week we have Shabbat HaChodesh, the Sabbath of the month, being the month of Nisan, which is such a profoundly important month in the Jewish calendar, the month in which we left Egypt, the month of Pesach, the anniversary of the birth of the Jewish people. And then after Shabbat HaChodesh, we have Shabbat HaGadol, the great Sabbath, which is immediately before Passover. The ceremony which we read about this morning from the Torah is a very peculiar one. Our ancestors were commanded to take this red heifer, free from blemish, a heifer which had not been broken in by a yoke, whatever difference that makes to the animal. Well, I presume it would be more aggressive. And then it is slain outside of the camp. Its blood is sprinkled by Elazar the priest 7 times in the direction of the tabernacle, and then its carcass is burned with its hide, its flesh, and its blood. And of the ashes that remain, when an Israelite became unclean because of contact with a dead body, water mixed with the ashes was sprinkled upon him in a ritual cleansing. And after a certain number of purifications over a certain period of time, with a lot of obsessional ritual detail, finally the man who was unclean became clean, but the man who made him clean became unclean, if you get the point. So we have a kind of an unclean circle. With the burning heifer had to be thrown cedar, hyssop, which I've never seen, but is supposed to be a vegetable, I presume something like parsley. Has anybody seen a hyssop? And shani tola'at, red thread. And of course, when we look back on Jewish tradition from a modern point of view, the obvious explanation which we think of first is that the homiletical explanation, the ethical implications. And the rabbis were not backward in giving ethical or homiletical explanations for why we have this very strange ceremony. The cedar of Lebanon, of course, tall, was the symbol in the ancient world of pride. The hyssop was a lowly plant. It grew close to the ground and therefore symbolized humility. The red, of course, symbolized sin. We have in the book of Isaiah the sentence, "Though your sins be as red as scarlet, they shall become as white as snow." And the whole idea of uncleanness in this sense, being associated with death, is related to the theological overtone that somehow, if one were perfect, one would simply, like an old soldier, keep on marching on and would never die. There is in Jewish tradition an idea which is made a much bigger fuss of in Christianity, that had it not been for Adam and Eve sinning in the Garden of Eden, no one would have died. Of course, there would be no population explosion problem because Adam and Eve would have been all alone, living till eternity. But because Adam sinned, therefore death entered into human history. So that being unclean and sinning and dying are all related ideas, and by linking these related ideas to the symbolism of pride and humility, the message is conveyed, as described by the ancient rabbis, that only a holy people could worship a holy God. Actually, the homiletical explanation, of course, is not the real explanation. We have to ask ourselves today, what could the origin of such a custom have been? We naturally would like to think there was some rational origin. Now, from a theological point of view, it is improper to suggest that there is a rational reason for the mitzvot. It is improper to suggest that our ancestors knew all about pork giving rise to tapeworm and other such sequences, and therefore they made the pig taboo. From a strictly theological point of view, there are many traditions which do not have such so-called health-giving propensities, and the reason why an animal may have been chosen such as this may simply have been for entirely different reasons, not necessarily for the rational reason that abstention from it was good and wholesome, and that therefore to make people abstain from it by writing laws telling people not to eat it would have been stronger than simply Moses standing up himself and telling people not to eat it. Nevertheless, although theologians strongly disagree with any suggestion that the original reason why these commandments were given was because there was a reason for them, a health reason, for example, we cannot avoid assuming that there may be some connection originally in this particular taboo, which relates to contact with the dead. When a person died in those days, presumably it often happened he died because of a disease. And that coming into contact with the disease conceivably might have spread the disease. And therefore the idea of not only being sprinkled with the ashes of the cow, which probably had a profound psychological impact on the survivors, and the psychological impact is not to be underestimated in these matters, and also the prescription to have an entire immersion or ablution in water, could not entirely be deemed to be without therapeutic purposes. It is also well known that the ancient world intuitively arrived at certain basic primitive cures which they did not know the reason for. Perhaps the best known is the discovery, accidentally, that foxgloves contain digitalis, which is helpful in the treatment of the heart. This was an old wives' remedy. For many, many centuries, people had known that if you boil foxgloves, you got something which apparently served some kind of a purpose. It was just stumbled upon. By the same token, the burning of certain herbs or certain trees or certain wood may conceivably have been regarded by the ancients as acting as a protection against the unseen powers who harmed people at the time of death. But also there may have been something in these herbs, which I do not know of, which may have actually had some therapeutic purpose in terms of disinfecting. One would have to go into much greater detail. Nevertheless, there are certain Jewish customs associated with death, and indeed, it's not just Jewish customs, but other customs, which do seem to indicate that although the rabbis disavowed ta'ameha mitzvot, that there were rational reasons for the mitzvot, there probably was some rational reason for it. I think an obvious one is the fact that when people come home from a funeral, they eat. They are enjoined to eat and to eat heartily. It seems to me that since, again, in the ancient days, when a person died, it may have been either because of disease or because of starvation or because of a lack of food, the idea of suggesting that in the presence of death, those who still lived were to, as it were, strengthen themselves, may have had some practical significance, which again the ancients arrived at by a form of intuition. Of course, the central theme of the red cow institution or ceremony is an idea which is so alien to the modern conception, the modern way of thinking, as to puzzle us. We only know of people washing to become clean in the physical sense. It's true that in our Madison Avenue age, we seem on television screens at least to be obsessed with Mr. Tide, Mr. Clean, and the white knight on the charger and all the other things. So maybe we've gone the other way from a purely physical point of view. But the ancients were not thinking about physical cleanliness when they spoke of the ritual of the red heifer. No matter how cleanly scrubbed a man who came into contact with a dead body had been, after he came into contact with a dead body, he still had to go through the ritual purification. He could have gone to 6 Turkish baths, but still, according to tradition, he was ritually unclean, even though physically he may have been spotless. So it's a way of thinking, not something discernible. There was nothing on the man, as it were, by way of some sign which would indicate that he was unclean. It was an attitude. It was a religious attitude. It was a form of taboo. And the best way I can describe what the ancients were thinking about when they devised this kind of ceremony was in terms of 2 analogies taken from the modern world. One is where you see men who have to work in nuclear laboratories where nuclear fission is taking place. They can't approach the nuclear energy because it will harm them, and they have to be themselves wrapped in lead clothes. And when they manipulate the atom bomb, or whatever it is, or the particular, they work in the pile, they often have to put their arms through special gloves in order that when they move the objects or the jars or what have you inside the glass cases, they themselves will not be exposed. Also, today we are more aware of the notion whereby in some space travel plants where spacecraft are built, Men have to be absolutely certain to remove every particle of dust from their bodies before they go in. And some incredible stratagems are used in order to make sure that they bring no extraneous objects into the inner sanctum, as it were, of the place where the machine is being constructed, which is to go into space. And they dress in robes which look very much like some kind of Masonic society or some kind of ritual, were it not for the fact that we know this ritual is associated with technology. Now, that is one analogy which indicates what the ancients meant. They felt that the power with which they were dealing, when they were dealing with God, was a power that was extremely dangerous if contacted accidentally. A man might not know it, but that object in the middle of the room is radioactive. He might be completely unaware of this. And of course, whether or not he was aware of it didn't matter if he touched the object. Because if the object was radioactive, not all his protestations, "Please, sir, I didn't know," would help him. The other close analogy to the idea of divinity, certainly in the biblical period, whence this custom of the red heifer arose, is the analogy of electricity. A man might have the best of all intentions, but if he tries to repair a large current-bearing wire in his house and forgets accidentally to turn the power off, then it's curtains. Now, it's no good in him saying, "Well, I forgot," or, "Well, after all, it's only the first time." The whole idea is ridiculous. One doesn't argue on this fashion. There is a wire, a naked wire, which is powerful, and if a person touches it, he's going to die. So explanation is out of the question. You avoid it. You don't argue with it. This is something closely related to what our ancestors believed about divinity. So when in the Bible you read how a certain man by the name of Uzzah, when the ark was being returned from the land of the Philistines, where it had been captured, and was being returned back to its place where it belonged, and Uzzah happened to be among the people escorting the ark, and the oxen stumbled, and the wagon shook, and the ark almost fell off. And Uzzah thought he'd be a nice guy to avoid the ark falling down, God forbid breaking. He put his hand out to stop the ark falling, and God kills him on the spot. And some people say, "Well, it's terrible. How can God do such a thing? It's ridiculous." Because they're talking about God from a modern point of view. That's not the way the people who wrote that particular story in the Bible thought of God. The people who wrote that story in the Bible, when it says, "And God killed Uzzah," on the spot. It's written there. Read it. Know your Bible. Learn a bit about the Jewish idea of God in the past. It's nothing to do with whether he was sorry or whether Uzzah lived an ethical life and, he had a wife and children, and he was the chairman of the synagogue, and such things shouldn't happen to a nice Jewish boy. There's nothing to do with this. There was a naked wire there on the ark. There was something radioactive there. And Uzzah, unwittingly, with the best of all intentions, touched it. Curtains. The Bible itself says, "The Lord thy God is a consuming fire." Now, as our ancestors developed and became more aware of the dangerous quality of the divinity, they decided they had to do something about it. Like living in a city where there are a lot of dangerous gas mains. We've had the problem here, A house blew up last year because there was an exposed gas main somewhere. Or there's a danger of somebody digging a hole in the street and suddenly putting a shovel through a wire. That's probably why Con Edison is painting all their trucks blue now, so they won't be recognized. So what do? You decide to have a proper system. You get a law passed and you start digging deeper, and you make quite sure you make a clear note of where every power plant is, and where every wire is, and where every line is, and where they come to the surface, and where they go underground, and you put them in places where no one will ever possibly dig them up. Have you ever been in the country and seen a sign, "Power line 50 feet below the surface," in the field? Let's hope nobody pulls it up. Otherwise, some poor guy is going to try to plant his gladioli next year and have an awful shock. Nice fellow, but it won't help him at all if his power shovel or whatever it is digs through a nice 3-inch thick piece of wire. In order to protect the unwitting Jew from any kind of lèse-majesté, any kind of accidental, unwitting contact with God, the whole temple system was devised by our ancestors to make absolutely sure that those who entered before God, who was believed to dwell particularly on Mount Zion in the temple, would be absolutely clear. They would have had their garments dust scrutinized. They would have to go through x-ray machines. They would have to make quite sure that they checked all their cigarettes and their lighters, etc., in the outside office before they went in. They would have to be absolutely certain they were wearing rubber gloves and rubber shoes, so that even in the event that something is wrong, they still wouldn't get harmed. So this is the whole purpose. And by the way, the whole cycle of the Jewish year was based on this conception, because the thought was that, well, maybe we're all right now, but maybe somebody brought in just a crumb of sin. Somebody accidentally, with all the precautions in the world, somebody got in, like Danger Man. Somebody got in by pressing a knob, by reflecting the reflector against itself and just got to leave. What would happen? Supposing supposing by accident somebody got into the temple, defiled the temple, and here are we thinking that all the wires are linked up to God and we're not getting through. God forbid we should do something about this. Once a year, what happens in the temple is like what happens at WINS on Sunday night after the discussion. I always think that radio stations should put up or shut up. They say they're 24 hours day and night, but they're not really. They shut down on Sunday morning in order to check the station out for bugs or one thing or another. That's what happens on the Day of Atonement in Judaism. Everything closes down, and the high priest goes through an extra special kind of purification. And every single Jew and Jewess goes through an extra kind of special purification. So that at least we know, sure, anything happens throughout the year which may cause difficulties, at least we know that once a year the station is closed down and every nook and cranny is searched out, so that we're pretty sure that the day after Yom Kippur we have a clean slate and we start all over again. Now it is only within this kind of context that the concept of the Para Adumah can be understood. This is the reason why the Shabbat Para precedes Shabbat HaChodesh, which precedes Shabbat HaGadol, which precedes Pesach. Because in order to be able to fulfill the Passover properly, the ancient Jew had to offer up a Korban Pesach, this Paschal lamb, which we still eat symbolically in the Afikomen, and it was eaten by family, and it was the most important meal, the most important and most ancient of all traditions in Jewish life. And the lamb had to be obtained early in the month of Nisan, and the lamb had to be brought to the temple court on the precise day, and the people had to slaughter it as one man in the evening, shortly before the Passover ceremony commenced, and the animal was slaughtered in the temple, and no one could enter the temple who had not been ritually and theologically and spiritually screened. And therefore Shabbat Para was a reminder. If you should have touched any dead man in the last few weeks, or if you have come into contact with any impurity, then watch out for it, brother, because the Paschal Lamb feast is coming. And if you wish to be classified as a Jew on that occasion, then you must come and be purified with the waters of purification. Of course, when the temple was destroyed, all this was over. Now, supposing, God forbid, somebody was made impure at a time before Passover, whereby there was no time to go through all the 7 days of purification. Don't worry, they thought of the question too. There was a Pesach Sheni, a second Pesach, which took place on the 14th day of the next month for those people who couldn't do it in time. And don't ask me what happened to those people who became impure just a few days before Pesach Sheni, because there's no Pesach Shlishi as far as I know. Now, thus far, one might say that our understanding of the idea of Shabbat Para, the cow, is the quotation cow. We have tried to understand what invested the minds of our people when they devised this ceremony, and what invested the minds of our people that they should have declared a special Shabbat, Shabbat Para. Is there anything affirmatory in the sense of my previous distinction between quotation and affirmation, davening and praying? There's a very interesting story told in rabbinic literature which indicates what the Para Adumah symbolized in Jewish tradition, related to what we said before about Dr. Bettelheim. Stories associated with Yochanan Zakkai, who lived in the first post-Christian century and who was alive when the temple still stood, and therefore who was acquainted with the actual ceremony, ritual of the Para Adumah as it must have been performed in the years preceding the destruction of the temple. Yochanan Zakkai was talking with his pupils, and apparently a Gentile passed by, and he had also seen the ritual of the Para Adumah and was as puzzled about it as those of you who read the English translation of the Bible this morning may also have been puzzled. And he said to Yochanan Zakkai, to me, this business of burning the red cow and mixing the ashes with water and sprinkling looks very much like witchcraft. So Yochanan Zakkai said to him, tell me, have you ever been mentally disabled? I suppose really he's asking me whether he's ever been meshuggah. has the demon of madness ever entered into you? Did you ever have to go to Bellevue? So the Gentile said, no. Have you ever seen anybody who had to go to Bellevue? No, I didn't. Well, oh yes, he said, the man says, yes, I do. I once did see somebody who had to be carried away. Well, how do they cure him? This man who suddenly became mentally disturbed and who had a demon of madness enter into him. Well, the Gentile replied, what they did was to take some pieces of wood and roots, and they made a fire underneath this man, and they made some smoke, and they began to sprinkle water on top of him, and suddenly the demon flies away. So Yochanan Zakkai said, you've given your own answer. You've given your own answer to this problem. The spirit which a man gets into his body when he touches a dead person is the spirit of uncleanliness. And the reason why the Jews sprinkle this water on the head of the man who has been come into contact with the dead body is to drive away the unclean spirit. It's just like what you've seen happening in the hospitals, a kind of theological ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. So the Gentile went away, apparently satisfied. But the pupils got very angry with Yochanan Zakkai. What sort of an answer was this, they said? Is this the way you deal with Jewish tradition? You give a rational answer like a psychiatrist? Instead of talking like a rabbi about God, you talk to this goy as if Judaism is simply a matter of rationality? Yochanan Zakkai said, he says, that was just for the goy. He said, that was just for the goy. He said, between us, he says, zwischen uns, the dead body does not defile, nor does the water purify. And any explanation which you try to find, whether a homiletical explanation, or a rational explanation, or a therapeutic explanation, nonsense, meaningless. God has said, Chuka chakakti, gezeya gazarti, eilachem reshut leharher achareha. God says, I have ordained an ordinance, I have decreed a decree. It is not permitted for you to transgress it. I think President Johnson would love that midrash. And so apparently with Dr. Bettelheim, this is the epitome in Jewish literature. I know of no midrash in the whole length and breadth of rabbinic literature which epitomizes so beautifully the arrogance of the Kierkegaardian leap of faith than this statement of Yochanan Zakkai, which is often quoted in Jewish tradition to explain the observance of the mitzvot by the Jew. Any Jew who says, I eat kosher food because it's healthier for me, is silenced in Jewish tradition. Kashrut has nothing to do with health. Kashrut is observed by the traditional Jew because of the same reason that the Jew sprinkles the ashes and the water of the red heifer, because God said so, and God's bigger than you, and you don't ask people questions. The rabbis say like this, if a master says to a slave, do this, and the slave says, Master, you're very clever, that's a very good idea. Where does a slave, and nowadays when the domestics answer back, that's another thing. But in those days, in an age when servants, when servants were like servants, having servants was the equivalent of ancient technology. You as much expected in the Roman or Greek period, when the Jews also had slaves, a slave to reply, than you expect a telephone to reply or a car to reply. One assumed, took it for granted, the slave would do what was asked of him. Now, the thing that puzzles me is that although Yochanan ben Zakkai gives this terrible answer, which is the epitome of dogmatic authoritarianism, which is the antithesis of what we Reconstructionists believe in, it is out of character of Yochanan ben Zakkai on two grounds. First of all, Yochanan ben Zakkai was not the sort of person who would be rude to a Gentile. I think his attitude was very unpleasant. If I were a goy and I asked the rabbi this kind of question, as soon as I walked out, they began talking about me behind my back, I'd be insulted. And the fact that you don't know that you're being insulted doesn't make the insult any better. And secondly, it does not seem to be within the spirit of Yochanan ben Zakkai's normal attitude. First of all, Yochanan ben Zakkai in the Talmud has a tradition of being very nice to goyim. Some of his best friends were goyim. He, I might describe in his age, as a most ecumenical character. It is of Yochanan ben Zakkai that the Talmud tells us that he was always first in the matter of saying good morning. The Talmud goes out of its way to point out, the Talmud has many other things to write, and ink wasn't so cheap in those days. But the Talmud says that Yochanan ben Zakkai always said good morning first. Afilu nochri bashuk. Talmud makes a point of saying not that he did this only to Jews, but he even made one that says higher. He was always the first to say higher, whether it was to Jew or Gentile. Is this the kind of person who would insult a goy just because he asked him about the red cow? Another story which the Talmud tells, only one example. A Gentile once said to Yochanan and Zakkai, we both have festivals. You have Pesach, we have Easter. You have Hanukkah, we have Christmas. Didn't quite do it that way, but I mean, kalends, Greek, but I'm just translating for a modern audience. But that's the way the Midrash runs. But the Gentile went on to ask, is there any Yontif which you Jews and we Gentiles observe together? Of course, if he lived in America, he'd have said Thanksgiving. Well, actually, he gave the ancient equivalent of Thanksgiving. Yochanan and Zakkai replies, yes, we do celebrate a festival together, the day when the rains fall. Thanksgiving, as it were, to God for the gifts of nature which fall on Jews and Gentiles alike. So we see that, in fact, Yochanan and Zakkai was a friend of the Gentiles and discoursed, had entered into dialogue with them, and it is unlikely that he would have been so nasty unless he had other things on his mind. And secondly, Yochanan and Zakkai is not an irrational, dogmatic authoritarian. He was very progressive. One of the big problems that the Jews had to face in the first century after the temple was destroyed was whether to believe that the temple would one day be destroyed, would one day be rebuilt, and that the ancient temple service could be reinstituted, or to believe that in fact the temple being destroyed put the end to a chapter in Jewish history, and that things had to carry on now as if the temple would not be rebuilt, at least for a very long time until the Messiah came. One of Yochanan and Zakkai's famous pupils, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, was of the opinion that no change should be made, since it was hoped that any day the temple would be restored. But Yochanan and Zakkai was outstanding in his age, the founder of the Academy at Yavneh, for insisting that a dynamic, progressive, if I may say so, a reconstructive approach towards Jewish life be adopted, so that all those honors which originally were exclusively paid to the temple, such as the blowing of the shofar on Shabbat, the taking of the lulav on Shabbat, all these traditions were transferred by Yochanan ben Zakkai from the temple, which was now no longer in existence, to the academy at Yavneh. In other words, what Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying, the seat of Jewish learning now becomes the temple. And in that revolution, it was a very revolutionary thing to do in those days. In that very revolution, we see the progressive attitude manifested by Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, I think when one realizes that we know a great deal about Yochanan ben Zakkai and his pupils, among whom Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was a great reactionary, I think that the pupil who reacted violently, this is just a conjecture, to Yochanan ben Zakkai's answer to the Gentile, really was Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. You know, when a teacher has a problem student in his class, very often he says something as a kind of a tryout to see whether the difficult pupil who is not reacting very well to the advanced thinking of the discussion, just to see, if I have a child in Hebrew school who believes that Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden is a real story, I don't say, why, you fool, how can you believe such a thing? We sort of discuss it and we start talking about it, and then I may come back and say something to see how this young man will react. I know he doesn't think Superman is real, but it worries me that of all the characters in ancient history, he should choose Adam and Eve as real characters. I'm worried whether that will not have a serious effect in his attitudes towards Judaism in years to come. And it seems to me that Yochanan ben Zakkai was trying his pupil out unconsciously. And when the pupil, of course, suddenly said, "What's this, Rabbi? Do I detect that you have reformed tendencies?" Yochanan ben Zakkai, in order to keep peace in the academy, immediately became more firm than the chief rabbi. And this again is a pattern that all of us have seen in many walks of life. That rather than sometimes concede that one in fact does have sympathies with a more progressive attitude towards life, one gets back behind the iron curtain of rigid dogmatic authoritarianism because one is under the mistaken impression that only thus can one save and redeem from bigotry and ignorance. And I'm not sure whether that approach is always the most wholesome one. And it seems to me that in a sense, we can be more critical of Bettelheim than of Yochanan ben Zakkai. Because Yochanan ben Zakkai, 2,000 years ago, could not be expected to understand the psychodynamics of authoritarianism. And therefore, we can judge him, the Chafsachut, favorably. Here is a scholar trying to grope towards some kind of a rational explanation for this primitive ritual. And then when one of his more reactionary students pulls him up, he immediately backtracks, understandably. He realizes in an age of transition what is at stake in the authority figure of the rabbi. After the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees as a group, the rabbis as a group, are no longer able to be as avant-garde, as progressive, as dynamic, as they were in the centuries, the decades before the destruction of the temple. But here we have a man like Bettelheim who knows the realities of the workings of the human mind, and yet still feels that this rigid authoritarianism of the 20th century, by the way, he is a psychologist and not a psychiatrist, so all the psychiatrists in the congregation can now rest that their particular speciality is not being impugned. We can see in the striving of Yochanan ben Zakkai an adumbration, a foreshadowing of the need for a mature religion, a religion which believes it is not the rituals which a man performs which guarantee the quality of his religion, but the spirit which invests the way a man lives in all matters, including the ritual observances he performs. We also, like Yochanan ben Zakkai, live after a terrible khurban, a terrible destruction of the temple of the Jewish people, the Holocaust in Europe. And we must also realize our obligations in terms of the demand for mature religion. In this sense, Pesach indeed requires the prelude of Shabbat Parah in our second affirmation interpretation of this concept. Shabbat Parah, when understood in terms of its role in the thought of one of the great leaders of our people, Yochanan ben Zakkai, is basically a challenge to maturity, a challenge not to authoritarianism, but a challenge to religious humanism. It is only when we see the limits of the status, authority, dogmatic, authoritarian elements in our social, religious, communal life, it is only when we realize the limits of the attitude which says, Chukah chakakti, I have made the decision, there is no further discussion. Only then, when we are beginning to realize the need for a mature religion,